And where do you think we're able to improve operations based on some of the technology that is available today that customers can use?
So there's so many areas. So I'll go into some of the experiences I have in PagerDuty. Is we normally see when things go wrong, and we like to deal with when things are working right. So if I look at when things go wrong, from the point of something detecting that there's an issue, which can be a human being actually raising an issue, or hopefully it's our observability, our telemetry, our monitoring, whatever you want to call it these days, through to resolution. So the biggest bang for buck is where we can compress that time. Where can we find savings? Where can we not get a human involved? Because the other thing is the amount of nonsense that some people are actually dealing with today, the toil on some of our critical stuff, as we mentioned before. So in a things are going wrong outside of the normal operation, that's where PagerDuty stands up. And also just some of the mundane tasks that we're getting. So whether it's environment provisioning, whether it's dealing with user requests and service desk requests that end up going through to someone that should be working on, for example, coding the next greatest release for an organization, we're trying to minimize and reduce that as well. And that's where we definitely see it going.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. And I think there's two strands within how we can help operations. So one is around, I guess, what's more traditional ops, where we would talk about event management, we talk about alarms going off, we talk about things we know that are occurring. And now with the advent of DEX tooling, with the advent of being able to monitor end user usage, we now have a whole new form of metrics that we can use to say, okay, well, are we giving a good experience as well as just, is it up? Because that's sort of that previous, well, it's up, so that's great, yeah? You know, we're hitting 98% availability, but end users don't just expect that today.
Yeah.
That's like the lowest common denominator. What they also want is a great experience. You know, if I'm ordering a ticket and the website goes down, that's a poor experience. It might be up, but or it's, you know, it's taken me 10 minutes to get to that point. That's not good experience. So I think I see it also as there's an opportunity now to bring that level of data in and then bring some level of automation to solve those problems that those users are facing. So, you know, in that scenario, we just spin up more capacity in the container, right? And then we can deal with it. That's the type of thing I also think we can do now to improve that user experience and improve operations itself.
But the amount of additional lenses you just mentioned on that whole ecosystem, which is hitting the same poor souls there. And it's interesting you mentioned kind of the view of the NOC. So we see traditional NOCs and SOCs still in use today. We see some organizations moving towards, say, scaled service ownership, where they have the whole ethos of you code it, you ship it, you run it approach as well that's spread across organizations. The biggest thing we see with every organization is no one is doubling their IT staff. Yep. No one is going through that massive growth that we saw pre-pandemic or even maybe early pandemic as we went through. In the last 18 months, we've seen typically in many organizations a reduction in the operations headcount, but an increase in those data volumes, the amount of work that we're supposed to do, the amount of innovation that we're supposed to kick out. We'll talk about the craziness that's happened in the last 18 months in the IT industry as well in a minute. So the age-old adage of doing more with less, I think, is consistently starting to be seen across teams today. Definitely in the space of operations, and definitely with the amount of data that's coming on in. So the question is always, how do we deal with these increased sense of signals? How do we deal with the volume? 99% of which is candidly utter tripe and garbage. But that's that one thing that you really don't want to miss. That is going to lead to that terrible customer experience.
Yeah, and it's cutting through. You're right there. It's cutting through the noise. So I mean, and that's one of the key issues I think a lot of customers are facing at the moment. It's like you said, that there's so much data, but so much of it just isn't relevant to actually solving the problem. And you have to sort of get rid of that. So the visibility of the actual issue comes to the surface, and then it's much easier than to do something about it. And I think there's a huge opportunity right now with the technology that's available, where you can get rid of that noise. You can focus on what part of that data is more important for your operations teams to be focusing on, and less worried about the things that should just be picked up or should just be done automatically. And then back to your point, therefore you don't need that staffing issue that exists for a lot of customers at the moment. You could take some of that pain away by just allowing the people that you do have to focus on that 1%. So back to your point, like 99% is tripe, I think was the word you used.
Absolutely, yes.
But just get them to focus on that 1%, and that drives much better opportunity to resolve more quickly, which ultimately is where we need to go and what customers want to try to get to.
Yeah. And it's great, and I think the market's moved on. So I'm going to mention AI. I'm going to avoid one part of AI, but I'm going to go old school AI and mention machine learning.
Yeah.
So a lot of the deduplication capabilities now are available out there. A lot of machine learning algorithms are really advanced and able to do that contextualization and grouping and keep absolute minimum amount of noise going through. I mentioned earlier today we had a customer that actually phoned us up to say we think PagerDuty's broken. That's like, why? We turned on some of your capabilities and features. Now we seem to be getting an awful lot less alerts coming on through. And it was a case we sat down with the individual and we were like, well, show us the alerts you're a little bit worried about, because you can see them behind the scenes in PagerDuty. And it was like, well, that one didn't come through. Okay, it didn't come through, but is it related to that? Yes, it is. We'll go and have a look at that incident. And there it was, all beautifully grouped together. So that's the aim that we're driving through, is through intelligent algorithms and machine learning to completely reduce that noise.
Yep.
I mentioned the driverless cars earlier. There's always going to be an obsession about sticking the steering wheel in a driverless car. So you've always got to have the ability to marry up machine learning with a little bit of human tweaking, that little bit of, if it is this alert, this does need to come through. So whatever you think machine learning algorithm, I do need to override certain parts of that. So yeah, reducing the noise and making sure people on deal on what really matters is key.
Yep.
We see a lot of problems with, we call them transient or flapping alerts as well. Things that seem like a problem when they get triggered, but about 5 minutes later calm down as well. So anytime we disturb an individual that should be working on something, that's 10 minutes lost. Even if it takes just a handful of seconds to look at something, we typically find that's 10 minutes of productivity lost. And it's amazing how that starts to mount up over time.
Well, I think visibility is really important. And then also, I'll be back to your point there about that 10 minutes of work. If I can get everything that I need immediately when that event that I care about comes through. So, the logs, the what's happened, what's caused it, potential resolution, all in front of me, then that saves me a huge amount of time. I think you mentioned earlier on about one of your customers that had that concept. Was it Zen 10?
Zen 10, it is indeed.
Where it takes, that 10 minutes and you're doing the same thing every single time.
It is. Yeah, the concept of Zen 10, it was one of the largest, it was a drinks retailer in the US. Effectively, when they had a bridge call, everyone would come together. So getting people together in the first place would take time. They'd all get together to simply say, I need to go and look at the log files. I need to go and look at our monitoring capabilities. I need to go and check the DEX findings that we've got on the systems as well. So they would disappear off for 10 minutes and then come together with then the next steps that they could go and do. We'll talk about how we can improve some of this later on, but the whole idea now is they brought that Zen 10 down to Zen 0.
Yeah.
The data is there, ready. The monitoring tools trigger off alerts. Their automated diagnostics now go out and do each one of those different things. I'll mention Gen AI briefly as well, because now we're seeing Gen AI taking in the context of all this incoming data, and then it's going out to go and execute some of those diagnostics based upon the variants and the different types of lookups that we might have to go and have a look into as well. It is fascinating because every customer at the moment that we speak to is they're on this journey to reduce that from it being triggered to being it resolved.
Yep.
We had Vodafone spoke at one of our recent conferences, and I've worked with those teams over the last 7 years since I've been with PagerDuty and beyond, actually, if I go into further in my career. They're seeing in 1 year alone, they reduce what we refer to as their mean time to acknowledge rates down from 20 minutes to kind of sub 20 seconds they're on. And their resolution times were in the digital teams were around about an hour down to, again, a matter of minutes to do that full resolution. And year on year, they're constantly looking at how can we push out releases faster. So they're typically even, I think the quote I had from Elizabeth the other day was about 200 releases per day alone amongst some of their teams. But how can you do that innovation at speed, but also reduce the amount of customer affecting incidents and impacts you actually have?
Yeah, and I guess that's the whole point, really. You're bringing in much greater productivity across both not only the operations and support teams, but also then across your dev team, because you're just taking the noise out. You're taking the things that take time away from them, and that allows you to focus on the releases. But also by bringing that automation, it means you've still got the control of those releases, because when they go in, you have all your monitoring, you have all your event sources, you have your observability, so you can really quickly triage what's happening. So you don't need to hold back on that change, because historically we would have said we can't possibly put that change in unless you've crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's, because you have to be 100% sure it's not going to cause an impact. Whereas now you could take a little bit more of a risk there, because you know that you can get on top of it very quickly, and therefore that you can still keep that rate of DevOps going forward without necessarily constraining it. I don't quite like the term fail fast. I don't like that term, but I think a better term would be to go forward more quickly. Yeah,
I understand where you're coming from.
You don't want to bring in failure, but equally you can take a little bit more. You can push the boundaries a little bit more, because you know your backbone is solid, and that you've got the opportunity to understand any issues and get on top of them really quickly. So therefore you can push those boundaries. Because ultimately, most organisations are trying to gain a market edge, or they're trying to keep up with the competition. So you can't stifle that development. You have to sort of work with it. And rather than seeing operations and service management as, that's that bit here, and we're developers and we don't really want to work with them because they constrain it. It should be one team. Yeah. Everybody should be working together, which is the common goal, which is to drive the company forward. And I think the technology available now is allowing those two areas to come together and work together, and that allow the company to go forward.
And you've definitely got to have a bravery. I agree with you on the fail fast. The amount of times my youngest now just says, I was just failing fast, Dad. It's like, no, you can't use that excuse anymore, son. But it's impressive. So the amount of organisations that we speak to, enterprise organisations, is fascinating. And one I really like to tell the story about was TUI, large travel organisation. And again, they've been at the AWS conferences this year, talking about the journey they've done from a lot of legacy operations, just code and infrastructure as well, to a nice, clean cloud journey. So operating, if I can get the stats right, 400 hotels, 130 aeroplanes, and Yasin corrected me the other day, 18, not 16, but 18 cruise ships as well. Their infrastructure, their mode of operations was struggling to cope with the changes. So they took that move 5 years ago, lift and shift, get rid of legacy, move to the cloud, obviously, which is why they're at AWS. But the big thing for them was changing that mindset, changing the way they were doing things, moving away from, as I say, the old school legacy way of running operations, and more of the scaled service ownership mindset, the transformation and the modernization that they had to go down, of kind of maybe even looking at SOCs and NOCs and thinking maybe it's a bit old school. We need to transform to something a bit better. Yeah, no,
it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also about using the technology to help you do that. So as well as sort of just driving that automation, a lot of our customers at the moment are struggling with some of the regulatory changes that are coming forward. Yeah. And one of the things where it can help is by taking all the data that you've got, all of those multiple data sources that we deal with now, and putting it into a logical, sensible order, is then allowing you to hit those regulatory requirements without, again, stifling that development and that progress, because you can use the technology to report on what's going on and therefore feed that back, or you can use discovery or observability to find out what you've got, where it is, how it's working, how it's interconnected, how can I better support it, and that allows you then to get control of those regulatory elements. So whether that's in the cybersecurity space, whether that's in the banking and financial space, the fact that I can prove to the regulators that I do have control, that I do understand what's happening, I understand where my data is going, I understand how I'm using that data, and I'm using the observability platforms and my machine learning platforms to help me understand where that's going, is a massive benefit. Because otherwise, you're just bringing so much control that it's very difficult to sort of drive that forward. And when you spoke there about organizational change, it's trying to get that over as well to an organization that actually can be a bit more fluid.
Yeah.
And there isn't any more risk coming into it, because we can control that risk using the technology that's available to us now, rather than having that as a sort of we're nervous to bring that in because it's sort of counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I got a few routes I can go down. One of my neighbours is a service desk. Well, he's a head of operations, and then one of his classic side jokes to me is always, "Best way to get rid of incidents, Tim. We don't do any changes whatsoever." So he just wants to lock things down as much as he can. But reality is, he really can't. And I love the fact you bring up some of the regulatory requirements that we've got. I always look in terms of when people look into investments in people, in software, and anything really, they look at the RCRs.
Yep.
Is there going to be top line revenue associated with it? Revenue, the R. Is there going to be costs that we can take out? So far, we've actually talked an awful lot of cost reduction.
Yep.
But you're right. The regulatory aspect or the risk aspect is something we're seeing growing a lot now. One I'm very fascinating in is Dora, so not the Explorer, and not to be mixed up with the DevOps research operations as well. But this is very much the Digital Operations Resiliency Act, which was introduced a while ago, and banks were supposed to move towards it, or financial services across EU were supposed to work towards it. I didn't hear about much of it about 18 months ago, but in the last year, it's become a reality. And some organisations are ahead of the curve. It feels like more organisations are actually slightly behind the curve on understanding the implications of DORA as well. Another one, it's not just the EU, everyone's at it. For want of a better description, down in Australia as well, they have, it rolls off the tongue, the Prudential CPS 230.
Nice.
This is a very similar one to that as well. So we've been involved in quite a few consultancies with some of the largest financial institutions in Australia to make sure that they're ready for that as well. And I suspect all these regulations are going to start going around the world.
Oh, without question. I mean, I think... whether you've talked about like NIS, which is coming up to NIS 2, is coming along this year as well. I think there's a huge amount of that control that's coming in, and organisations have to be ready for it. And this year in particular, back to your point, is coming up much more than I've ever seen it in the past. But we're just in a really good place where we've got that sweet spot of the technology available to us now, leveraging AI that we didn't previously have. So we've got a massive opportunity to really get on top of that. And we've been working with quite a lot of customers to use the technology in the right way to answer the questions that they're being asked. So to prove control, to prove resilience, to understand how they are maintaining and using their applications. Yeah. And there's a huge opportunity there to I think really help companies get to where they need to be in that space.
It is, because the digital, we talk about the omni-channel experience. It feels like in a few years' time we're going to move to there's only really one channel that people are going to be able to engage an organisation in, and that's digital. Yeah. Phil LeBrun, again, spoken on tour recently. He has some beautiful slides about how the banking industry has changed over just the last 20 years in technology alone, how it was always walking into a branch or phoning up a call centre, and all those avenues are disappearing now. It is all online. It's all via the app. That is the only way to interface with a lot of financial organisations today. So it's got to be perfect. It's got to be resilient. It's got to be reliable as well.
Yeah, no, it's a huge change, huge difference.